Right, so today I want to talk a little bit more about BLM and why they're so important is that they're pretty much one of the biggest things going on right now. And it isn't just an American thing, like I pointed out too, is that there's number one, there's a lot of these protests going on in Canada. And number two, we have a government that thinks that, oh, racism is this huge issue. So a lot of people, you hear that pointed out to, it's so isolated to a states thing. Now, again, um, the violence is something that's mostly isolated to the states. I mean, there was some rioting in Toronto and Montreal, I believe, but the point being is that when you bring this up too, is that a lot of people are aware of this kind of stuff, but they refuse to criticize them. And I really don't understand why. I mean, I understand why. The main reason is people want to be are afraid to be called racist, but um, the reason I don't understand why is that if these people get power, we're going to be in a far worse spot than the very small amount of racism that goes on too. I mean, that's the other big thing with BLM is that they perpetuate this idea that society is horribly systemically racist when they can't give you an actual example of that because, and by an actual example, I don't mean this is the thing people always bring up. Oh, well, blacks are overrepresented, in prisons compared to their percent of the population. Well, that doesn't prove anything. That's literally correlation causation fallacy because, again, men are like, what, 90-95% of the prison population, and no one's suggesting sexism. Therefore, just because there's a disparity, it doesn't prove anything. Like, it doesn't prove anything. So what you would need to do is have a study or something that shows, hey, blacks commit X percentage of crime and they are still overrepresented. If they can come up with that study that proves that, then I would be like, yeah, there is systemic racism, but because they haven't done that, it's rather safe to assume that that data doesn't exist. And because they haven't done that, not only are they admitting by default that this systemic racism isn't really a thing, they're admitting the opposite, right? They're admitting the opposite. When you look at the crime victimization surveys, when you look at the likelihood that the amount of crime that blacks commit, if anything, they're actually underrepresented. But I wouldn't even necessarily argue that to a strong degree. I think that you look at the crime victimization surveys, yeah, it shows blacks are pretty much in jail for almost the exact likelihood they are to commit crime, right? So I guess the main thing to point out is that the percentage of the population does not matter. It does not matter. The amount of crime committed as a percentage is the number that matters. So, anyway, the first thing I wanted to bring up here is from Ian Miles Chong, and he's linking to this Sasha Johnson, who's a BLM activist. I don't know how prominent, but that doesn't really matter. And that she says, I don't even know what they are, but whoever they are says, the white man will not be our equal, but our slave. History is changing. No justice, no peace. And again, these people are just flat out admitting it. They don't want equality. They don't want that. They want supremacy. A lot of these BLM people are black supremacists. And again, people, this is the problem too, is that you have so many people out there justifying the rioting, justifying the looting, and the minute you do that, you justify the next thing. Because the minute you justify something, you don't just justify everything right up until that line. It's exactly what's gone on too. You have all these politicians and celebrities and all these idiots that are justifying this. Well, the minute you justify that, you justify the next step, right? Like you have all these people justifying um, the rioting and the looting, or even going, showing up to people's houses. You have people justifying this. Well, what happens next? Because people that have had no pushback when it comes to showing up to people's houses, you get then they go knock on the door, they break down the door, they break windows, they threaten people, and then that's justified. And then what do? They go in and they beat up the person, and well, that's justified. And what's next? They drag them out on the street and kill them. So this is the problem: is that the minute you justify any amount of violence, you're almost guaranteed to justify escalating tensions. And this is the problem too that I think is going to happen if things keep going like this. And the caveat, if things keep going like this, is that massive amounts of people are going to die because, again, eventually people are going to get tired. They're going to push back. And what happens when people push back is that they push back twice as hard, right? So this is, you know, they're going to push back twice as hard. And what happens then? Well, the other side's going to push back twice as hard, and eventually you end up with a civil war. So that's the big problem when it comes to this. Next thing, again, there was a video that went viral a couple days ago of a black guy um, attacking a white guy for no reason. Now, again, the first thing to point out too is that people say, "Oh, that's not racism," but the thing that they don't tell you is that the guy who originally posted this, um, he said something like, I think it was "white lives don't matter" in literally in the post. So again, this was most likely a racist attack, but yet was there any rioting, looting? Was the mainstream media all over this? Well, no, they could care less. So again, this is just more proof that this whole systemic racism and BLM and all this garbage has nothing to do with systemic racism or equality or any of this kind of stuff. It has everything to do with pushing a far left social justice political worldview. That's the main thing. And the other thing is, it's largely an anti-white thing. Though it is partially an anti-white thing because of the race issue, but it's also an anti-white thing in that the far left hates whites because whites are the only group of people, or at least the largest as a percent of people that don't vote left, that don't support these crazy leftist ideologies, specifically white men, which is why the left always goes after white men, right? So that's why this kind of stuff is always going on. So um, yeah, and this is the thing too, that this would be an example that if it was in the reverse, this would be an example of actual racism that these BLM people could actually point to, right? The problem is that they just assume, white cop kills black man, regardless of whether or not it's justified. They just assume that it's racism, which means where's the proof? Where's the proof? Because there would be two ways to prove racism. Neither one of them BLM does. Like I say, the first way would be is if the cops had a history of making racist posts on social media. And again, criticizing BLM is not racist. This is something I see all the time. You have free speech, right? You can criticize any group of people you want, no matter how, cops have the right to criticize Mother Teresa or charities or whatever they want to do, right? As long as they're not inciting violence, they have that free speech. So again, this is the other thing they'll point out. Oh, I know a cop who criticizes BLM. Well, that doesn't prove anything. Again, um, a racist. I'm not going to say something, but again, racism is something that just disagreeing with a group of people, no matter what they claim their intentions are, doesn't prove anything. So again, that would be the first way. The other way, like I said, would be proving that um, cops target blacks at a rate higher than their likelihood to commit crime. Too, like I say, the thing they always point out is, oh, blacks are 13% of the population and 25% of the police encounters and/or people in prison, therefore racism. No, like I've pointed out a million times, it doesn't mean anything. The only way that you would prove racism is if you could prove that blacks are, let's say, 20%, they commit 20% of crimes, but are in prison 25-30% of the time, right? Like that would prove racism, but they don't do that either because they know it doesn't exist. So anyway, the next thing I wanted to bring up here is from Paul Joseph Watson, and he has a story he puts out saying a scientific advisor to the UK government says the lockdown was a panic measure and a monumental mistake on a global scale. And again, we're starting to see this more and more, that the severity of the whole virus situation continues to get downplayed. The whole 6% thing from the CDC admitting last week is um, another groundbreaking piece of evidence that just proves the idea that the lockdowns were needed, that the clear knee-jerk reactions to this was needed. The only precautions that we really needed to take, looking back on it and continuing going forward, is precautions when it comes to the elderly and to a lesser degree people that have comorbidities. Now, specifically elderly people with comorbidities, but um, And not to mention too, like the vast majority of elderly people do not work, so that's not something that's hard to do. And here's the thing too, people make the argument, oh, we can't do that because then you're going to spread it to you're going to spread it to your grandparents or whatever. Well, you're the same kind of people who still want social distancing and mask wearing and all that garbage anyway. So either way, if those people had their way, they're still going to have all the precautions anyway. Like it doesn't make any sense. So anybody under 50 to 60, especially healthy, um, should be going about lives pretty much exactly the way they were before. The evidence clearly points to that. There should be precautions when it comes to nursing homes and when it comes to the elderly. If we would have did that from day one, we arguably would have had less deaths. In fact, I do believe we would have had less deaths because um, we would have been a lot more stringent when it came to nursing homes. We would have been a lot more stringent when it came to closing our borders. But on the other hand, we would have let the healthy young population would have reached herd immunity, right? So it would have been a win-win-win. There would have been no downside to that position pretty much whatsoever. The last thing I wanted to bring up here is from Corey Morgan. He says, want to end the class size dispute, compensate teachers on a per student taught basis. That will quickly end union demands to reduce class sizes rather quickly. Now, again, this hysteria when it comes to reopening schools is really, really boring and really just stupid because the reality is that the thing that teachers want is I mean, the main thing a lot of these people want is they want to be able to not work and still get paid, right? Because who wouldn't want to not work and still get paid? So that's the first thing that comes is that if you don't want to teach, fine, I really could care less, but you don't get paid. That it's very simple. And they'll make the argument of, oh, it's unsafe, but the reality is that it's not unsafe. There is plenty of occupations to where people come in contact with double digits amount of people on a daily basis that are not complaining. In fact, can you find me one other occupation to where people are complaining at the rate teachers are? Well, no, you really can't. And the reason teachers are complaining so much, I think it comes for a few reasons. But the first one being is that teachers have really done a good job lying to people about their value in society. And it's not that they don't have any value. It's just based off the amount of money they're being paid compared to the amount of value they're providing to people. Yeah, they're not nearly even close, right? Like if teachers were as valuable as they're being paid, the average person should be able to come out of high school and get a job making 20, 25 bucks an hour, no problem. But the vast majority of people can't do that. I mean, a lot of people even with degrees can't even do that. So the idea that teachers are worth the amount of money they're being paid is absolutely absurd. And again, and then you bring in the fact that you bring in the whole unions thing. Well, unions basically exist to, people make the argument, oh, they're there to protect the workers. Well, that's true to a small extent, but the main reason unions exist is to, number one, um, have whatever members of said union work the least while making the most while getting the most benefits, right? That is the goal of unions. And the problem with unions is that they're good in some ways, but they're also bad in some ways, in that there needs to be a reasonable middle ground, right? Like if it was up to unions, teachers would be making, six-figure salaries with full pensions and working like half the year, like literally. But again, that's absolutely insane. Now, again, I've pointed this out many times too, is that in a free market situation, if a teacher wants to can earn a six-figure salary and have full benefits, and have whatever 2, 3, 4 months off during the year, I'd be fine with that. For the simple reason that any teacher earning that much is doing it because they actually are worth that much, right? So, and this is the problem too with public school teachers, is that they're not worth as much as they're being paid, because the minute you bring up any sort of competition to public schools, the vast majority of them are vehemently against it. Now, why are they vehemently against it? It's not because it's a worse system. Again, they'll make that argument, but the data clearly disproves that. And even if it is a worse system, well, fine. Like and this is the thing too. Either way, they're wrong. Either way, they're wrong because number one, either the having a charter and or private competition is better, right? Or
it's not better, but they have nothing to worry about, because if it's not a better system, well then, charter schools and or private schools would pop up. um, some people would go to them. They would quickly realize that they're not getting as good of an education, and they would go back to public schools, and no one would go to charter schools anymore, and they would go out of business, right? So either way, they're wrong about this. Like either way, they're wrong about it, and that's the thing that I really can't stand about them. And it's not all the teachers too. People make the accusation, "Oh, you hate all teachers." No, I largely only just dislike the unions and dislike the ones that believe this garbage, because there is plenty of them that don't believe this garbage, but it is a majority that believe the garbage. So that's why I'm calling them out. Is that just because there's a few exceptions to the rule doesn't mean the rule still doesn't exist. So anyway, that's the last thing I wanted to bring up. If you like the video, make sure you hit that like and subscribe if you haven't already. Um, Make sure you follow me on Twitter, on BitChute, and on Parler. All those links are in the description, so you can find them all there. And make sure you stay tuned for more.